Here with the amazing Jeb Stuart. Jeb, it's incredible to look at your career and realize that you've impacted the action, thriller, kind of anything excitement related when it comes to just fun Hollywood films. It was so much work. How did you? Because I know in previous interviews you weren't a big film guy growing up.
No.
You got into the writing part of it first. What was it about writing, maybe the escape, or what attracted you to picking up the pen and writing?
There are sort of two different questions there. One, why I always wanted to be a writer. I mean, I really wanted to write, but I wanted to write it like the Great American Novel and that sort of thing. I got into screenwriting in a very strange way. I had been when I got out of undergraduate studies, where I'd gone through the writing program at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I was trying to write short stories and hoping someday I'd write a novel. And I was a tennis pro, and I married my high school sweetheart, who was working in Manhattan in New York, had a great job, and I was down in the South, and I convinced her to come down, and she knew that I wanted to write. And we spent a wonderful first year of marriage, and then suddenly there was an intervention. And it was an intervention between my wife and my father, which was like, this is great to want to write, but when, Esquire and Playboy and the New Yorker are sending these stories back with notes on them like, don't ever come to us again, I knew that something they were saying, maybe you don't have what it takes to do this. And so I said, okay. And they said, well, what we are going to do is we want to see if you have any aptitude toward this. So they had signed me up, unbeknownst to me, at a university up in North Carolina. I was living in South Carolina at the time, to be tested 2 days to see if I had an aptitude for writing.
Wow.
And you go up there, yeah. And if I didn't, by the way, this is the important part, I would go to law school the next day, okay? Or I'd go to business school or whatever else you did at that time. So I go up there, and the first day, the PhD who ran the program, it's 8 hours of testing a day. It was a serious kind of aptitude deal. So I go up the first day, you give an interview like this, what do you like, how are, that sort of thing. And I told them about growing up in the South and on my grandfather, and I used to go hunt Indian arrowheads, and we'd ride in a pickup truck, and he would tell me stories. And lots of times when the stories weren't great, when we'd be coming back, he would tell the story again, but it would be tweaked. It would be rewritten so that I would laugh or get or whatever. So I learned a lot about rewriting from my grandfather as well, but I knew I wanted to write. Anyway, I also worked for my grandfather. He was a great horticulturist, so I took care of his gardens, and I knew everything there was about camellias and azaleas and dahlia. Anyway, the next day I go into the parking lot for the second day of testing, and he's standing in the parking lot, the PhD who ran the program, and he's got that big sheaf of, this was years ago, he's got the big sheaf of computer paper, when they kind of came out like that, and he's waving it like this. So I pulled my car in, and he said, oh my God, you scored off the charts creatively. We've never had anybody score this high creatively before. And I said, to be a writer. And he said, oh no, to be a florist. And I was like, well, I can't sell that at home. Okay, so he said, well, come on in, we got a second day of testing. So I went in for the testing, and I'm depressed. I can hear law school, calling my name right at this point. And I'm sitting there, and those were in the days when Time magazine always did a summer issue an issue where they did Hollywood, and they would highlight a big movie, and then have lots of sidebar articles. And at the bottom of one of the sidebar articles was an article about a screenwriter who made a great living, had never had a movie made, okay, but he'd been working for 10 years just nonstop. I thought, well, I never thought about movies. I never thought about writing for film, but you could make a good living, and it was in an industry, and it was full of other creative people. So I'm waiting for the testing to be set up in the other room, and I'm in a college placement office. So it's surrounded by the bulletins from universities. So I pulled a bunch of them off. I didn't know what a film school was, but I knew that Southern California had one, NYU had one, UCLA probably had one. They were all closed for admissions for this year. I needed something today, okay? So I pulled down Chapel Hill, where I'd gone undergraduate, and they had a Master's of Communication with one screenwriting course. And I thought, that'll do it. So I told the PhD as he came in, so we're all set for you for the second day, and I said, you know what, terrible news. My father-in-law is very ill, and I have to head home right now, because I had read that Chapel Hill's closed their admissions entries the next day. So if I was serious about this, I had to get home. I had to marshal the forces and get back. So I drove 5 hours back to South Carolina, practicing this speech I was going to give to my wife. And I got there, and she's waiting in the driveway, and she said, well, and I said, I scored off the charts. Creatively, they've never had anybody to be a screenwriter. And that was like saying an astronaut. I mean, we're in a little town in South Carolina, and she said, how do you do that? And I said, well, it's great that you asked that question. Chapel Hill has a master's in communications. It closes tomorrow in terms of, she said, let's get in the car. I drove back to North Carolina, slept on the doorsteps of all my professors, got my recs, got the application in, and I did the master's. And then I followed that up with another master's at Stanford, which was all screenwriting under Julian Blaustein. And that was when the Nickel Fellowship was at Stanford, and so I did the Nickel there, won the Nickel, which I was very lucky to do. And so 5 years later, I come out and I'm a screenwriter, and I get a 4-picture deal at Disney, and then Die Hard and the whole thing. And to end the story, because I owe a lot of this to this person. My wife, who took that great leap of faith years later, became very ill, and as she was dying, I thought, you know what, I probably should come clean on this idea that I scored off the charts. So I said to her, that was all a lie. I didn't score off the charts to be a screenwriter. And she's listening to me, and she finally says, well, I knew that. And I said, well, you knew that? I mean, it's like, this has been my cross to bear for 20 years. And she said, no, about 5 minutes after you drove out of the parking lot at that university, the guy called you up and said, I got to hope your father is better tomorrow. This is terrible. And she said, what? So anyway, and then she passed away 2 days later. So I owe a lot to that, and I say this all the time to young screenwriters. I said, you need to be motivated. It's more than just wanting to be. You need a wife that you can't let the truth out to get you motivated, get you over the hump. Anyway, the long story you asked me why I got into it.
That's probably the best story I've heard about getting into it. That's perfect. Can we jump back though to being at Stanford and doing the Nickel and how that did kind of impact you, because that still has such weight and merit in the writing community, and what was it like for you to take home that?
It meant for me, and I'm sure it does to the Nickel Fellows today, though it's a very different award in many other respects because they give more of them, it meant that somebody had validated what I did. And it also meant that somebody was going to pay me to write the next script, which I really, which was very important. I mean, I'd been in graduate school for 4 years. I needed to know that this was the next step, and more importantly, my wife needed to know that this was the next step. I also was motivated by the fact, and this is going to answer the second part of your question. I needed. The deal was I needed to be able to write that script, the Nickel script, quickly because I had a premature baby at the time who I didn't have insurance for, which cost me about $200,000, and I had all that graduate school debt. So I'm coming out of 5 years of school with, a lot of money that I owe, okay, which brings me to the answer, part B of your question, which is why action movies and why Die Hard and things like that. I had my marching orders were do not write anything that needs subtitles, okay? If they can't figure out what this movie is in China, you shouldn't be writing this movie, okay? So car chases don't need subtitles, okay? Guys jumping off buildings and explosion stuff. And quite frankly, I had a lot of training that I just kind of pulled over into the action world. How to create a scene, how to develop characters, how to make an audience worry about a particular character even when he's about to jump off a building or, get run down by a train or something like that, something crazy. If you don't care for him, you're not going to follow him. And I think that's the world that I, came out of academically and had the good fortune to, have the ability to talk to writers, to have these kind of, ask these questions you're asking me at that time, and then kind of incorporate it into whatever the style it was. And that style, by the way, had to have some action involved in it, because that's where the money was for me, and I needed to get out of debt.
Wow. And it's fascinating because you're right. The characters do have. There's always like a family. I mean, with or like the ex-wife or something that pulls them in a direction. With John McClane, it's the loss of not having his family with him that's impacted him and changed him. How did you how did you change your writing though? I mean, were you reading different stuff after you realized you had to start doing more action stuff?
I incorporated. I had to write. I had to read everything. When I was at Stanford, they had at the time, one of the great script collections on earth in the rare books room at Stanford, and we were required to read, anywhere from 3 to 7 scripts a week and break them all down, so you know where you are in a script. And that served me well because I've done an enormous amount of rewriting and script doctoring over the years, and it's important when a production is hemorrhaging $250,000 a day or more. If you don't know your way around the story, you can't just come in and say, God, I think the whole third act sucks, I'm going to throw that out. Well, they've already built those sets. So now you're costing people even more money. Can you fix the story? Is the story, you launch this ship for some reason, find out what it is. What was the heart of that whole piece, and how can you put it back together without just, completely destructing it? So I read a lot. I read a lot of dramas. I read a lot of comedies. I read a lot of old stuff. I read a lot of Hitchcock. I had a lot of great, mentors who had been Hitchcockian writers, and just kind of focused on that part of it. What can you take from this great big pantheon of screenwriting and make into what I want to do? But I think it all comes back to what you said. If the character is not somebody that you can relate to, if it's not a Richard Kimball, or even John McClane, he was just the wrong place at the wrong time. You're not going to bring the audience along for the ride.
I'm curious then, because so many writers, there's the ego that so many people think of, the writer's ego, but every interview I've looked up from directors that mention you and your style and being on set and being really easy to work with all say the exact opposite, that it seemed like Jeb was able to change wording for whenever they needed a scene change. I mean, you worked so well on set where other script writers, it's their baby. How are you able to separate that?
I had an epiphany on my second movie. And it was a movie with Liam Neeson and Helen Hunt and Patrick Swayze, and it was called Next of Kin. I worked with a British director, John Irvin, and I remember the very first day we brought in some actors to read, and Liam was reading, and what he read, I could swear I didn't write.
Wow!
Meaning he just took it and elevated it to a different place. And then when he saw my look, it was kind of like, well, he was like, do you need it a different way? Do you want it, and I wasn't the director. John said, yeah, that was okay. Give us another thing. And he, and they did it, and it was even better. And a great actor takes it to the next thing. So the epiphany was, I'm not alone, on top of the mountain. It's like, the cool thing about this industry is that, there are so many phenomenal elements that make a scene powerful. I was watching the clips from The Fugitive today in my panel, and there's the scenes. I chose this clip because we started it in North Carolina, we finished it in Chicago, but it was the tunnel sequence that ends with him jumping off the dam. And as I'm watching, there's so many elements that Andy Davis brought to it, the director. There's so many elements that Michael Chapman did when he was shooting in those tunnels with the lights and the fact that the noise and stuff like that the editors did to cut that piece together. Tommy and Harrison, so rarely are on camera together. And I was on the set when they were doing the scene when he says, "I don't care," they're in the freezing cold water in an old Westinghouse warehouse in Chicago. It's probably not even heated. I was under a big down jacket, and I'm thinking, these guys are crazy to be in this flowing water that's just, it's like an amusement park that the production designer had built, this massive set. All those people added to that one line of dialogue. There's very little dialogue in that scene, and yet it goes on for over 2 minutes. Yeah. And, you need, James Newton Howard's score, to make you get really. So I love that aspect of it. So I don't have the ego that a lot of people have, though I'm not above. And I think most directors will say the only time he gets testy is when it's like, you guys are taking this ship and you're just driving it into a cul-de-sac, and good luck to see if you can get it out of there. Because I get paid to go, test every cul-de-sac in the neighborhood to find the through street. Okay, it's too expensive when we take 150 people with us. So trust me on this. You're going to die in that cul-de-sac, and that's not my ego. It's the I'm the sort of steward of the story, and somebody's got to be that person, and somebody's got to be able to say to an actor, because the director's got a million other things that he's got to deal with. It's a good idea, but it's not that good an idea. Okay, and I'm not above stealing your idea. However, if it's better than my idea, so anyway.
When you dived into the director's chair with Switchback,
Yeah.
Can you tell me where that story came from? Because I've heard some rumors that was based on a real event that happened to you. That's just a small moment.
The real event happened was the scene where Danny Glover pulls up to Jared Leto in the car, and the door opens up, and there are photographs of nude women all over the car. In my experience, I was hitchhiking back when I was in college, and the door opened up, there were nude men all over the car, and I did not get in the car with the person. But I always thought that in the right situation, that could be a great opening to a movie. And in my script, that was part of my Nickel script, and it was called Going West in America. And it had and that was written before serial killer stories were all over it was people didn't know what a serial killer was. And I was at Stanford, and of course Stanford, was built on the railroad. So there was this huge railroad part of the library. And one day when I should have been reading scripts, I was actually looking into the Leland Stanford Railroad part, and I was thinking about all that, and I thought, God, this would be a great sort of, layering for a great thriller, perhaps. And so that's where that started, that one little piece of opening up the door, and in my world, you get into it, and then it's like, well, be careful what you wish for, because it could be so freaky you want to get out, and you go out and you get into a bar, and then the next thing you know, the bar is worse than the car was. So anyway, that's...
With having a project for so long, how did you finally tackle doing it?
Well, I didn't want to do it, quite frankly. I mean, the script had been optioned at Columbia when I came out of graduate school. My deal was at Sony. It was cast. Robert Duvall was cast in it. Kevin Bacon was cast in it. Sidney Poitier was cast in the role of the Dennis Quaid character.
Wow.
It was all set to go, and then the head of Sony was fired, and it was put in turnaround. That's before I knew what turnaround was. And it just sort of bounced around for many years. Actors would come knock on my door wherever my office was and say, I just read this script. I really love this script. And finally, Steven Seagal got hold of it, and he wanted to do it. And he took it to Paramount, and Sherry Lansing, she bought it. And this had been sold before, and she bought it again, and she said, I said, wow, that's fantastic. She called me up and said, we're going to do this, but I'd like you to direct it, and Steve Seagal's not going to be in.
Wow.
So I said, okay. I was kind of confused by it. I said, but I don't direct, and I'm really not interested in it, and I have a really great day job, and thanks very much, but I'm glad you bought it. And she said, think about it. And I thought about it. I went back and I told my family, I said, this crazy thing, Sherry called and she asked about this thing, and she thought it had this great idea that I directed, and I thought that was so stupid, and everybody said, that's a great idea. And so I went back, called her back, and I said, who's going to produce it? And Gail Hurd was producing it. And Gail is terrific. And the only thing I would say, if you're an up-and-coming screenwriter and someone says, the head of a studio calls you and says, we're going to make it, make sure it's not in Colorado in the dead of winter with trains, okay? Anything other than that was probably a good place to start, That was a tough show.
Was it Oliver that shot?
Oliver Wood, yeah, who's great, who's terrific, who's done all the Bourne.
Yeah. He's taken a whole nother level.
Yeah.
I'm curious, so now that you're not in Stanford, you don't have that big library, where did you go to find just what you wanted to read, and that just, even for just a personal level, what did you look for as a reader? As a reader,
I like to read nonfiction. I find that some of the best stories come out of nonfiction. I've adapted novels before. Just Cause was a novel, John Katzenbach novel. Heart's War was a novel. But if I'm going to do a novel, it ought to be a book that doesn't have the. It's not well known. I wouldn't want to do a big. I mean, wouldn't want to do the Hunger Games, for example, because I would be afraid that I would just offend everybody. You know, I like something that I can twist around. I can take the story. I can move it into different directions, and nobody knows that I've done that. And I think that there are a lot of times in nonfiction you have the ability to take a story and to fictionalize all the elements that that don't quite work dramatically. I went up to San Francisco one time on a television project several years ago to interview an African American homicide cop named Napoleon Hendricks. Napoleon is a great name. He was like 6'8", 300 pounds. Okay.
Wow.
And he was the very first black homicide cop in San Francisco. As a detective. And he was in his late 60s, maybe 70s when I went up to interview him. And he was a legend in San Francisco. And he single-handedly took their solve rate in the homicide from like 35% to 80%. So, he
Wow.
knew what he was doing. So we spent 2 or 3 days together. He takes me all the cool places in Oakland and the Bay Area and stuff like that. And at the end of the second day, he said, Jeb, I've been interviewed 1,000,000 times. And I mean, all of everywhere. And he said, I've noticed a very funny trait about you. You never bring out a notebook, and you don't seem to make. You never ask me to spell something or to get the thing right, or ask me for the fact again just so you get it right. I said, Napoleon, my job isn't to get it right; it's to get it better. I'm going to take those kind of crappy stories that you're talking about, and we're going to try to elevate them all. And he was like, that scared him to death, because for the very first time, truth wasn't involved in it. Fiction had kind of stepped in. And I think that that's a very good thing for people to remember, too, when they're adapting stuff, is that, it's not to get it right, it's to make it better, whatever it is. So anyway, that's what I look for.
And it kind of harps back to what you're saying about your grandfather taking on the trips.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Wow.
That's exactly right.
So, you brought up your wife that passed away, and
Yeah.
you took that time to be with her,
Right.
And it took us away from you, and that we didn't get to see what you're doing. Do you mind telling us what made you come back after that?
Well, money made me come back after that, but the business had changed a lot. I had about a 5-year hiatus where I had to care for her, and when I came back, it's a fast-moving business. There are a lot of people who have moved on into other things, producers that I knew who are no longer producing. Mm-hmm. Studio heads turn over all the time. And I think I changed, to be honest, I think I changed a little bit too. I mean, but one of the things that I realized is how much I really love writing screenplays. I mean, I had a much better appreciation for it. And lately, I like a lot of feature writers, because if you're doing action and features now, it's usually men in tights. There's a lot of comic book stuff, and I can't relate to that as well as I can relate to more of an everyman type of guy. And I think that we'll eventually come back to that. But in the big corporate world, the studios now, those things don't pencil out quite as well. A $75 million fugitive is really a big thriller. And, once you put prints and advertising and you put those costs to it, and it makes $100 million, that's not going to move the needle. Whereas if this was a comic book situation that had overseas sales and international stuff, you can make a $250 million movie that makes $1 billion.
Yeah.
So I think that you're either going to make movies like Luc Besson does, which are like Taken, which are really good character-driven action movies that are made for a budget in a domicile where they'll get rebates and things like that, or you're going to make big, flashy type of action movies that like Transformers. Anyway, so I like a lot of writers. Back to my point, I've kind of gone over to the television side, because I think that the television side has got some of the best writers. Personally, I think. That are doing it. I think that there are so many more outlets for great stories. I mean, 10 years ago, you wouldn't make Breaking Bad. You wouldn't do things like that. And so, I've moved over, and I get a chance to do stories like, I just adapted a great book called The Boys of 67 for cable, which is a Vietnam story. A very cool type of group about that last class of guys who came over, and to be able to track them on television is just, it's a writer's dream to kind of continue to develop good characters over a longer period of time.
Well, I had the question about what you read. What do you watch as a TV fan?
Boy, that's a really good question. I watch everything. I mean, I really do. I mean, I'll watch stuff that. I watch everything from a Downton Abbey to Orange Is the New Black. It's like because one thing is I want to see what people are doing, and I like. I don't have a long attention span. I mean, if you don't entertain me, I don't care how everybody is talking about how great this is. It's like, okay, I'm old enough to know, I'd rather be watching, the football game, or something else than that. And I live, there's just not enough bandwidth to take on everything that's out there. So like a lot of people, I try to catch up on stuff, from a tablet or something like that. But I'll watch everything from, from like a really great comedy like A Modern Family, which I'm in awe of the way they can take themes and tie them together and move a story through, with so many voices in the room. I think it's a really great thing. I like things that I can step away from afterwards and appreciate, the skill that was behind it, even something like The Walking Dead. So you can tell I'm kind of all over the place as far as this is concerned.
Speaking of technology, how has that impacted your writing? Have you updated to, with the technology, or do you still like, a typewriter? I mean, how have you adapted?
When I was in graduate school at Stanford, I remember we had saved up to buy this brand new electric typewriter, and the day I unpacked it, Stephen Jobs gave everybody, well, he didn't give, it cost me $500, the first Macintosh. And it was not on the market yet, but all the graduate students at Stanford were given the opportunity to buy one. And I mean, I tossed that typewriter so fast. It was like coming out of a cave. And from that point on, I've always felt like, technology is the way to go. I mean, when I do, I'm 10 times more efficient now because I can get answers to everything, every strange demonic thought in my mind. I'm sure, the NSA or somebody. I mean, somebody is following Jeb Stuart because I need to know what caliber a German sniper rifle is, and how what kind of bombs are attached to Reaper drones and stuff like that. I mean, they're tracking me. I guarantee you. That's right. So, but that's part of it, and then a lot of it is just. I think you can get hung up on the technology and just forget about the fact that people watch movies and watch television because of the character. And if you don't have a good feel for human nature and character and what makes your skin crawl and what makes you feel good and warm, that's you're not going to be a good writer. So it doesn't matter what kind of technology you got.
I'm curious, coming to a festival that showcases the writer, that showcases the greatness of, or the importance of the script and the people behind that. How have you enjoyed, you're about to do Die Hard versus Lethal Weapon. I mean, that's got to be like, when I looked at it, I was like, that's going to be the best one. It's going to be you and Shane just like, no, I'm a little better than you. No, this scene's better than you. How much fun are you having at a writer's festival?
Typically, I resisted this festival. The first time I came was about 10 years ago or so. And I resisted because I'm always suspicious of writers, okay? And I'm more suspicious of people who talk about writing. I came from a place where I had to write. I had to, I had to do it because of the story I told you about my wife, and also the fact that I felt like, there was just a part of me that I just felt like I needed to prove myself that way. And the only way to do that is to be writing, not to be talking about. When I was in graduate school, the writers that talked about writing were the guys who ended up running studios. Okay, they didn't end up writing scripts, and I found that their writing was flat and stuff like that. There's just no easy way around it. It's just tough. So now that I feel like Methuselah at this festival, I mean, I actually feel I don't mind talking about it as much. 10 years ago I didn't talk about it. And Shane and I did that same panel 10 years ago, and it was a different type of situation then. It'll be very interesting to see how how another decade has passed on these two projects. But one is the single male protagonist, and one is who I think is still the best buddy picture of all time. And so it's a fun. That's a fun. No one says I do it better than you, because, quite frankly, I think he's pretty incredible. So anyway.
Well, kind of last question, since you've talked about being able to, you've gone all over the country, and your first script was about going across the country. Where do you like to visit? What are the places in the country that are your gems? Maybe not Austin, but just when you think of, I'd really like to go there, even just to think about it, what places in the country attract you?
I love. I've now grew up in the South. I've lived in the Northeast. I went to school in the Bay Area, and I've lived in and out of Los Angeles for the last 30 years. I think it's great. I feel very comfortable in Texas and in the middle part of the country, and I've shot movies in the Rockies. I love it. I think there's something very, very cool all over the country, and there's not some place I'm dying to say, gosh, that's still on my bucket list. If there was, it would be probably, I remember scouting locations for Switchback years ago and ending up in Montana to look at a railroad with my whole crew. And we got there, and something about it, the railroad wouldn't work, but I loved every other aspect about the location. And I thought, this is an area that it's very different from the plains of Alabama or the mountains areas of North Carolina. It's very different from the Great Plains, but yet there was this space. So I'm always looking through the prism of a story. If I'm in the Bay Area, it's just I can remember being down at Stanford and my wife working in the city and hopping on the train in a T-shirt in the middle of the summertime and getting off the train and thinking, what the hell is this? It's freezing and cloudy and foggy, and it felt like Jack the Ripper was everywhere. I look at a city and I think, what story is embedded here? Wherever it's Detroit, whether it's the South or it's Miami, where everything looks great. I'm distrustful as hell of every place that looks great. So there's nothing on my bucket list, maybe except northern Montana right now, but we're lucky to be in a place, and you preface this by saying, I've been a lot of places and I've talked to lots of people from all over. It's very, very cool to be in a place like Austin where you're bringing in writers from all around, and everybody. What I like to say is, when you're finding that voice, make sure it's from that place wherever you are, and not the place. I used to try to write of that guy from California. I'd never been to California. So I want to, my voice was always of the places that I knew real well. So anyway.
Is there anything you're itching to get out? Is there that story that you're just waiting to finally tell, or are you still searching for? Oh,
I have a couple of much more intimate, like thrillers, that I'd love to tell, and when the market's right again, I will do that. But and there are a couple of big action pieces that I'd really like to do with the right people too. So when I have that moment, I'll try to get to those too.
I think that's a perfect way to end it. Jeb will be coming for you soon. I love that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was fun.